As you're aware, GRDC has historically sponsored WANFA, SANFA, CANFA, now I can't say it, Victoria No-Till Farmers Association. But if you have a look at the fact sheets available on the GRDC website, you've got guidelines for deep ripping, delving and spading. Have you got some sort of pest or weed problem? There's guidelines on cultivation for integrated weed management. There's guidelines for the use of tillage for integrated mouse and locust management. Don't forget integrated slug and snail management. Lots of guidelines on tillage. Do you have a disease problem? There's guidelines on the use of tillage for rhizoctonia and nematodes. And did I mention lime incorporation? All while not tilling. Is anyone else confused? I was thoroughly confused. Just for those of you who don't know me, I came from the mining industry. I walked into this and thought, somebody's not listening, somebody's not looking, there's something wrong here. So this was a temper tantrum. And it was a real ordeal convincing GRDC that we had to address what I felt was a very major contradiction in our extension advice. And I pointed out very untactfully that whatever the farmers filled in their forms, GRDC could claim 100% adoption, because if they weren't tilling, great, they got that message. If they were tilling, they got one of these messages. GRDC couldn't lose. To make my life more miserable at this time, just as I was getting this project up, I got numerous emails and phone calls and text messages from all the well-meaning urban academics in Australia telling me that if you dared stick a plough into a soil that had been under no-till for 20 to 30 years, you would undo all the good you had ever done in that 20 to 30 years of no-till. So here's your first take-home message. Now let's look at a quick example of why we have used tillage. This side of the fence, well, this side of the trial, lime was not incorporated. On this side, lime was incorporated. A couple of depth increments here, 0 to 2 centimetres down to 12 to 14 centimetres. Where the lime was top dressed, you've got a pH of 7.3 at the surface. Absolutely useless. Look at the acidity you've still got at depth. Have a look here where we've ameliorated the acidity by incorporating the lime. You've picked up an extra 850 kilos of faba bean yield and trebled the gross margin. That's the sort of reason we have used tillage in the past. That's an example of incorporating lime. It's not very soluble. It's not going to do anything sitting on the surface. Okay, what have we found in this particular project? I want to show you some of the data. We have lots of physical and chemical measurements. We've got a fair amount of biological measurements as well. But what I want to focus on is soil structure. That, to me, is what's proving to be the very sensitive issue in all this. It was driven by soil conservation. That's why we retain stubbles and we don't plough. We need to conserve our soil. And I'm from that era. I'm a soil conservationist. I want to keep my soil where it is. We've used wet aggregate stability for this talk. Yes, I've looked at saturated and unsaturated hydraulic conductivity and a whole bunch of soil physical measurements that I can't pronounce and equations I don't know how to use. But this that I'm going to show you is the wet aggregate stability. So you know what that means? Particles bigger than 250 micron, we want them. A high proportion of those in the soil gives you that good crumb structure. Particles less than 50 micron, we don't want. That's just the dust that clogs your pores and gives you that firm soil that isn't well aerated, doesn't have good water movement. The first trial I parasitised while John Kierkegaard wasn't looking was his own long-term trial at Harden. He had a bunch of plots there that were more than 20 years old that had had a history of direct drilling. We split those into ongoing direct drilling, and the other half of the plots we put in a rotary hoe, either with stubble burnt or retained and mulched. This axis here is our wet aggregate stability. Now for these macro aggregates up here, remember we want big numbers, and for the dust we want little numbers. Now, I'm a pictorial sort of person, so these upside-down triangles are my representation of knife-point press wheels, okay? Just remember that, upside-down triangle, knife-point press wheels. These green, dark green circles out to the side here, around the trial, the farmer had had a pasture for 5 years. So we went in and looked at the wet aggregate stability of his pasture. To my complete utter amazement, they actually agreed. So we've got a good benchmark here. This is the sort of best wet aggregate stability we're going to get out of this sandy soil derived from granite at Harden. So direct drill, stubble retain, old pasture. We went in, when I say we, if Tony Swan's here, he actually did this. We went in and rotary hoed, not once, but twice. And we did a lot of damage to the wet aggregate stability of that soil. We've gone from 70-something% to about 50% wet aggregate stability. Mission accomplished, soil stuffed. What I'll draw your attention to, we sowed this to pasture, ryegrass and subterranean clover. 2 years later, it was all over. That's not statistically significant at that point. We did go back to square one. We did damage the soil, but in 2 years, the recovery under pasture was complete. Microaggregates, the dust. Yes, rotary hoeing did create a lot of dust in that soil. 1 year later, it's all over. We're back to where we were. Unfortunately, the story's not so pretty for continuous cropping. I'll draw your attention to these triangles here. Again, I'm a visual person. Upside down triangle is still knife point press wheel. The black version of knife point press wheel is where the stubble's burnt, ash. I'll draw your attention to the fact that right from the outset, where stubble was burnt, we never had the same aggregate stability as where stubble is retained. And right through the trial, stubble retention has got a higher wet aggregate stability than stubble burnt. In other words, what I'm leading to here, there's an interaction. The effect of tillage on the soil is not independent of stubble management. The circles represent my rotary hoe. That's my symbolic measurement. Again, stubble retained, the black symbol is stubble burnt. Where we used offset discs, rotary hoe, this is just one rotary hoeing, not two rotary hoeings, we had about a 10% loss of wet aggregate stability. 2 years later, 3 of the treatments had caught up. So where we had put in a rotary hoe and stubble was burnt, problem was solved in 2 years. But I have to acknowledge this gap remaining in years 3, 4 and 5, where we are relying upon crop residues to fix soil structure, we have a problem. Where we have a pasture phase to fix soil structure, we're setting you back 2 years. If you're burning your stubble, we're fine after 2 years. The effect of rotary hoeing is gone in 2 years in a stubble burnt system. But for stubble retention, we have an ongoing small gap. It's only 5% of the wet aggregate stability, but I want to acknowledge there is an issue there. We had 5 to 10 centimetres depth. Yeah, I should tell you that other half of the story. Have a look what's on top now. Rotary hoeing gives you the best soil structure. In other words, some of the damage at 0 to 5 centimetres that I've just showed you was nothing more than soil mixing. We've put some of the good soil from 0 to 5 centimetres at 5 to 10 centimetres. Hence, rotary hoeing appears to have improved soil structure at 5 to 10 centimetres. Flip side, some of the damage to the surface soil is nothing more than the mixing effect of the rotary hoe. 2 years, there was an NS there, I've lost it somewhere in translation, but again, 2 years, no statistically significant effect of any of those treatments. We had 3 trials on farmers' properties where we used the farmer's gear. So these weren't little plots, these were farmer scale plots. We used the farmers' tractors, the farmers' offset discs and scarifiers. I'm just showing you one such example. The trial was split in 2. Half the plots we tilled in 2012, or ongoing no-till. The other half of the plots received their tillage in 2013. We were concerned that the antecedent moisture content, temperatures, etc. may have an effect on our results. So rather than have all the tillages occur in 1 year, we had half the plots tilled 1 year, half the plots tilled the next. And when I say direct drill, I rub that out. Knife point press wheels. For some of you that's no-till, for some of you it's zero-till, for some of you want to measure the amount of soil disturbance, knife point press wheels. Wet aggregate stability on this axis, only 3 years on this axis. This time the filled symbols represent the tillage in 2012. Those black symbols run underneath these hollow symbols, which are the 2013 tillage. Here's our macro aggregates. You can see all the error bars. Apart from one randy bugger there, nothing. There was no statistically significant effect of tillage in that year or that year, offset discs, scarifiers, or ongoing no-till. Have a look at the micro aggregates. There's one significant effect at that point there, the same as occurred here. No measurable damage, therefore no recovery time at this site. I selected this from our 11 sites because I knew this was going to be the site that suffered severe damage from tillage. Failed. My soil science sucks. There was no damage, no recovery period. 5 to 10 centimetres depth at that site. Yeah, there's the odd strange point that I can't explain, but it's not part of a trend. There's just these odd random effects. There was no significant effect to explain. There's nothing of practical significance, let alone not much of statistical significance. Now, if you were farmers, you'd be asking this next question. What about yields? In general, dry matter and grain yields were either neutral or positively affected by tillage. There was not a site year where tillage sent yield backwards. The farmer cannot lose. His grain yield is always neutral or positively benefited by tillage. Here's an example of the Daysdale site that was a bit odd. This is vetch dry matter, the reason being he had a ryegrass resistance problem at this site. It's been sprayed with everything known to man, including a few off-label things. So we went in with a dry manure crop, vetch dry manure, to finish this site. So there's no grain yields here. This was sprayed out for brown manure. Where the plots had been cultivated in 2012, that's 3 years earlier, okay? It's been under knife point press wheels since 2012. It was tilled once in 2012. We had less than 5 tonne per hectare of vetch, with the offsets 6 point something tonne of vetch. Where it was tilled in 2013, same story. Tillage has had a long-term beneficial effect 2 and 3 years later. There's no mystery in this. In this case, what happened was where we've cultivated the soil, we have a better distribution of pH and phosphorus within that soil profile to about 15 centimetres depth. When we got frosts, which layer of soil gets coldest? When the soil dries out in spring, where does the soil dry out first? By having better pH and better phosphorus below 5 centimetres, we've ended up with better dry matters and more phosphorus in the tissues where we had that cultivation effect. So a prolonged conclusion section now. Tillage can do damage to soil structure in some site years. I will not deny that tillage does something we don't want to happen. It does predispose the soil to storm events that can cause wind and water erosion. I want to hammer the point, therefore, that we're not standing here and saying, go and till, she'll be right, mate. We need to exercise caution. The damage, however, is generally small, 5 to 10% of wet aggregate stability. For the purists in the room who have been sending me love letters, yes, it's true that the macro porosity of the soil was severely negatively impacted by tillage. I admit that. But I don't know anybody who gets paid for their macro pore structure. Sorry, you're at the bottom of the priority list. Recovery is from 1 year to greater than 4 years. It depends on the severity of the tillage and the rotation that follows. Stubble is not good glue for soil. Fresh residues, particularly legume residues, seem to be the key. Why? Because they've got fine roots. The residues are great for fungi. They promote fungal growth. Yes, we've got biological data on that too. Fine roots, fungi, they seem to love fresh residues and they promote this better aggregate stability in the soil. Now, after talking to the farmers in Corowa, this game's called the game of, I don't know, what do they call it, game of drones? Oh, I've lost my lines. That's terrible. Okay, this was snakes and ladders, and I've lost some of my black lines. We started down here in soil hell, where there was burning of stubble and grinding of steel in our soils. And by maintaining good practices, we were going to find ourselves in soil nirvana, where we didn't have any disease and there was no production limits. If you had knife points and press wheels, you got closer to nirvana. Those of you who were good at changing bearings and could afford a disc seeder, you got closer to nirvana straight away. Those of you in stubble retention, wonderful. Green and brown manure crops, wonderful. But what we were told was, if at any point you dared cultivate that soil, you went all the way back to hell. You lost all the good that had ever been done in your soil. I'm going to do the Buddha thing. If you cultivate, for whatever reason, a legitimate reason, you do not go back to square one. You go back a few squares. If each square represents a year, yes, there's no denying you go back 2 to 5 years. In the case of John's surface soil at Harden, it could be 5 years or more. But the world does not end. So the practical message, we are not advocating a return to recreational tillage. We're saying that strategically applied, that might only be once every 5 years, might be once every 10 years, depending on your agronomic circumstances, your plagues, your diseases, your weed burden, the need to incorporate lime. And if we sensibly apply that tillage, 15 degrees slope, not before a storm is forecast, when you can ribbon the soil, all those old rules of thumb we had about tillage, in those circumstances, strategic tillage can be used with net beneficial effects in mixed farming systems, at least in southern New South Wales. I'm going to be bold enough to claim that maybe it could even work in Victoria. My thank yous. I had a huge team of farmers on the steering committee, consultants who were very generous with their time, a huge pool of researchers, and they sat through a lot of temper tantrums over 5 years. I thank them for being involved in this project, and we'll now take questions from hopefully not too irate an audience.
Thanks, Mark.